Cedarville, Indiana, had always been the kind of town where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. Its streets were lined with modest homes, their lawns immaculately maintained. Neighbors waved at each other in passing, kids played ball in the cul-de-sacs, and the loudest commotion anyone could recall was the occasional 4th of July fireworks mishap. But in July of 2010, the tranquility of this small Midwestern town was shattered when Jacob Callahan, a beloved handyman, vanished without a trace. Jacob wasn't the kind of man who disappeared. At 39 years old, he was as reliable as the sunrise, a steady presence in a town where everyone seemed to know him. Need your leaky faucet fixed? Call Jacob. Fence sagging after a storm? Jacob was your guy. His warm smile and kind-hearted nature made him more than a handyman. He was a friend to many in Cedarville. For over a decade, he and his wife Helena had built a seemingly perfect life in their modest home on Willow Creek Drive. But as police would later uncover, perfection was merely a facade, and dark secrets simmered beneath the surface. Helena Callahan was the opposite of Jacob in many ways. Where he was steady, she was restless. Once enamored by Jacob's quiet stability, Helena had grown discontent over the years. She craved excitement, luxury, and the kind of attention Jacob, despite his unwavering devotion, couldn't provide. Jacob sensed her growing distance but believed he could bridge the gap. He worked harder, longer hours, hoping his efforts would rekindle their bond. But to Helena, his dedication had become a burden, a reminder of a life she felt trapped in. In late 2008, Helena met Michael Trent at an upscale charity event. Michael, recently divorced and brimming with charisma, was everything Jacob was not. He was ambitious, charming, and had an air of danger that drew Helena in like a moth to a flame. Their connection was immediate and intoxicating, and what began as harmless conversation quickly escalated into an illicit affair. For months, they met in secret, their relationship fueled by shared fantasies of escaping the lives they had built. Michael whispered promises of adventure and passion, and Helena, desperate for more, began to believe him. By the summer of 2010, their affair had reached a breaking point. Jacob, though unaware of the full extent of Helena's betrayal, could feel her slipping away. On July 14, 2010, his worst suspicions were confirmed. That evening, Jacob returned home early from a job, his hands still rough from a day's work. The house was unusually quiet. As he walked through the front door, he noticed an unfamiliar pair of boots by the entryway. His chest tightened. Moving further into the house, he found Helena in the kitchen. She wasn't alone. Michael stood next to her, his hand resting casually on the countertop, as if he belonged there. The air crackled with tension. "What the hell is this?" Jacob demanded, his voice low but shaking with anger. Helena's face flushed, but it wasn't embarrassment, it was defiance. "Jacob," she began, her tone cold, "we need to talk." The argument that followed was explosive. Helena accused Jacob of stifling her, of holding her back from the life she deserved. Jacob, heartbroken and enraged, turned his anger toward Michael, who stood silently until he could no longer take it. Neighbors later reported hearing muffled shouting, but none of them intervened. Inside the house, the confrontation reached a boiling point. In a moment of panic and rage, Michael grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it at Jacob. The sound of the impact echoed through the room, followed by a deafening silence. Jacob crumpled to the floor, his lifeless eyes staring at nothing. Helena stood frozen, her mind racing. Michael dropped the skillet, his hands trembling as he stared at the man he had just killed. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What have I done?" Helena's reaction was eerily calm. After a moment, she knelt beside Michael and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Listen to me," she said, her voice steady. "We can fix this over the next few hours." The two worked in grim silence, their hands stained with dirt and guilt. They wrapped Jacob's body in a tarp, dragging it through the house and into the backyard. Helena, ever pragmatic, chose the spot carefully. She had often talked about installing a patio there, and now that plan served a sinister purpose. Michael dug while Helena kept watch, her sharp eyes scanning the darkened street for any sign of prying eyes. As dawn broke, the once pristine lawn bore the marks of their gruesome work. Exhausted but resolute, Helena began crafting their alibi. She called a few friends later that morning, casually mentioning that Jacob had stormed out the night before after an argument. Her tone was calm, her delivery flawless. Over the next few days, she planted subtle details to support her story, mentioning Jacob's supposed dissatisfaction with his life and leaving a note written in his handwriting on the kitchen counter. It read, "I need time to think. Don't try to find me." Meanwhile, Michael became a constant presence at the Callahan home. When neighbors raised eyebrows at his frequent visits, Helena brushed off their concerns, claiming he was helping with home renovations. She even hosted a small gathering at the house, laughing and mingling as if nothing had happened. To the outside world, she seemed like a woman coping admirably with her husband's sudden departure. By December 2010, Michael had moved in. His belongings seamlessly blended with Helena's, and their relationship, once hidden in the shadows, was now out in the open. Few questioned the speed with which Helena had moved on, though whispers of impropriety circulated among Cedarville's more observant residents. On a chilly afternoon in February 2011, Helena and Michael exchanged vows in a backyard ceremony. The patio, now complete, was adorned with string lights and potted plants. Friends and neighbors gathered to celebrate, their laughter filling the air above the very ground where Jacob's body lay. The choice of location was audacious, almost taunting, a symbol of their newfound freedom and a chilling testament to the depths of their deception. For months, Helena and Michael lived as though nothing had happened. But secrets as dark as theirs have a way of surfacing, and by March 2011, the perfect life they had so carefully constructed was beginning to crumble.
By March 2011, the new life Helena and Michael had built together began to show signs of strain. What had once been their shared secret started to weigh heavily on Michael, whose guilt had grown unbearable. His usual charm and confidence were replaced by a nervous energy. Small things, a lingering glance from a neighbor, the sound of a passing police car, made him jump. Helena, however, remained resolute. She dismissed his unease with cold pragmatism, insisting that they had covered their tracks perfectly. "What's done is done," she would say, her voice firm. "There's no going back." But Cedarville was a small town, and secrets rarely stayed buried for long, especially ones as sinister as theirs. The whispers started slowly, passed in hushed tones over coffee cups and through the aisles of the local grocery store. Neighbors who had initially accepted Helena's version of events began to grow suspicious. Why had Jacob left so suddenly? Why hadn't he contacted anyone, not even his family? And why had Helena moved on so quickly, marrying Michael only months after Jacob's disappearance? These questions swirled through Cedarville, casting a shadow over the couple's idyllic new life. The tipping point came on the night of March 5, 2011, when an anonymous tip was delivered to the Cedarville Police Department. The caller, whose identity remains unknown to this day, claimed that Jacob Callahan had not simply left town but had met a far darker fate. The tip directed officers to the backyard of 127 Willow Creek Drive, where, the caller claimed, Jacob's body was buried. The next morning, Cedarville police arrived at the Callahan residence armed with shovels and a search warrant. The crisp spring air was heavy with tension as officers began digging beneath the neatly maintained lawn. Word of the search spread quickly, and by mid-morning, a crowd of neighbors had gathered along the sidewalk, their faces a mixture of curiosity and dread. The sound of shovels slicing through the earth was punctuated by whispers among the onlookers. "I always thought something was off about her," one neighbor murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "She moved on too fast." Another added, "And that patio. They built it so soon after Jacob disappeared. As the officers worked, Helena and Michael were nowhere to be seen. They had been escorted to the Cedarville Police Department for questioning earlier that morning, leaving their house eerily empty. By noon, the shovel struck something solid. The distinct edge of a tarp came into view, its dark material stretched tightly around a human form. The officers exchanged somber glances, and the murmurs from the crowd fell silent. The body was carefully unearthed and later identified as Jacob Callahan. He had been buried for 8 long months beneath the very ground he had once worked tirelessly to maintain. The discovery sent shockwaves through Cedarville, shattering any lingering illusions of innocence surrounding Helena and Michael. As the investigation unfolded, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Forensic analysts combed through the house and backyard, uncovering damning evidence that pointed directly to Helena and Michael. Soil samples from the burial site matched microscopic fibers found on a tarp stored in the garage, as well as traces on Helena's gardening gloves. The fibers, though small, were enough to link the couple to the crime scene. Further evidence came from financial records that revealed Helena's startling behavior in the weeks leading up to Jacob's disappearance. She had drained Jacob's savings account, making substantial purchases that included high-end furniture and unexplained cash withdrawals. These transactions stood in stark contrast to the financial prudence Jacob had been known for, painting a clear picture of greed and premeditation. Neighbors also began coming forward with observations that cast doubt on Helena's earlier claims. Several recalled seeing Michael's truck parked outside the Callahan home late at night, long before Jacob was reported missing. Others noted Helena's sudden shift in demeanor following Jacob's disappearance. Once reserved and somewhat distant, she had become outgoing and vibrant, hosting gatherings at her home and showing little sign of grief. One neighbor, Mrs. Klein, recounted a particularly unsettling memory. She threw a dinner party just weeks after Jacob went missing, Mrs. Klein said. She was laughing, pouring wine, like nothing had happened. It just didn't sit right with me. Detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the events leading up to Jacob's death. They learned that Michael had been a frequent visitor to the Callahan home, initially under the guise of a business acquaintance. What began as a professional relationship quickly escalated into a passionate affair. Witnesses described seeing Helena and Michael together at local events, their chemistry undeniable to anyone paying attention. The timeline detectives constructed painted a far more sinister narrative than the one Helena had offered. It became clear that Jacob's disappearance was no accident. It was the result of careful planning and cold-blooded execution. Back at the Cedarville Police Department, Helena and Michael were placed in separate interrogation rooms. Helena, ever composed, maintained her innocence, insisting that she had no knowledge of Jacob's death. He was struggling, she told investigators, her voice calm and measured. He wasn't himself in the weeks before he left. I thought he needed time to figure things out. Michael, however, was less composed. As detectives pressed him, the cracks in his story began to show. His initial confidence gave way to hesitation, and his answers grew increasingly inconsistent. When confronted with the mounting evidence, his demeanor shifted entirely. Tears streamed down his face as he buried his head in his hands. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he confessed, his voice trembling. I didn't mean to. I just lost control. Michael's confession was a turning point in the investigation. He admitted to striking Jacob during a heated argument but insisted that Helena had orchestrated the cover-up. According to him, she had been the one to suggest burying Jacob in the backyard, her cold pragmatism guiding their every move. She said we'd be free, Michael told investigators. She said we could finally be together if he was out of the picture. As the evidence against Helena and Michael mounted, the community of Cedarville watched in horror as the true depth of their betrayal was revealed. Jacob Callahan, a man who had given so much to his community, had been silenced by the very people he trusted most. The quiet town, once a haven of peace and neighborly kindness, now found itself at the center of a chilling tale of greed, betrayal, and murder. But the investigation was far from over. The discovery of Jacob's body and Michael's confession marked only the beginning of a case that would uncover even darker secrets. For Cedarville, the worst was yet to come. By the spring of 2011, the town of Cedarville was no longer the quiet, peaceful community it had been. The discovery of Jacob Callahan's body and the arrest of Helena Callahan and Michael Trent had turned the once idyllic neighborhood into the epicenter of a national media frenzy. Reporters descended on Willow Creek Drive, their vans lining the street, cameras pointed at the house that now seemed haunted by its dark history. For the townspeople, life felt surreal. This was the sort of thing that happened in big cities, not in their close-knit community. Helena Callahan sat at the center of it all, her once pristine image now sullied by suspicion and scandal. In the days following her arrest, she remained defiant, maintaining her innocence with a composure that unnerved even the most seasoned investigators. Dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, she appeared calm during her initial court appearance, her expression betraying no hint of guilt. Michael, by contrast, looked broken. His eyes were hollow, his shoulders slumped, and the weight of his confession seemed to press him further into his seat. Though both were charged with Jacob's murder, their stories were already beginning to diverge, and it became clear that each would attempt to save themselves at the other's expense. The trial began in January 2012, and the Jefferson County Courthouse was packed with spectators. Local residents and reporters from around the country filled the pews, eager to witness the unraveling of a case that had gripped the nation. The prosecution, led by a sharp and relentless district attorney named Rachel Hart, painted Helena as the mastermind behind the crime. Hart described her as a cold and calculating woman, driven by greed and ambition, who had manipulated Michael into helping her rid herself of her husband. She wasn't just dissatisfied with her life, Hart said during her opening statement. She wanted more money, more freedom, more excitement, and she was willing to do whatever it took to get it. The prosecution presented a damning array of evidence. Financial records showed that Helena had drained Jacob's savings account in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, spending lavishly on furniture and luxury items that she claimed were for their home. Receipts for a newly built patio, paid for with Jacob's money, were entered into evidence. The patio, prosecutors argued, was not just a home improvement project, it was part of Helena's cover-up. Photographs of the backyard wedding Helena and Michael had held just months after Jacob's death were shown to the jury. The images, which featured the couple smiling and laughing above the very ground where Jacob had been buried, sent a chill through the courtroom. The prosecution called it a grotesque display of audacity, designed to flaunt their new life while hiding their crime in plain sight. But the most damning evidence came from Michael Trent himself. After agreeing to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence, Michael took the stand to testify against Helena. His voice trembled as he recounted the events of that fateful night in July 2010, describing how Helena had encouraged him to act. She said it was the only way, Michael told the jury, his hands shaking as he gripped the edges of the witness stand. She said we'd finally be free, that we could have the life we always wanted. Michael described the confrontation with Jacob, the blow that ended his life, and the hours that followed. He admitted his role in the crime but placed the blame for its orchestration squarely on Helena's shoulders. According to him, it was Helena who had suggested burying Jacob in the backyard, Helena who had crafted the alibi, and Helena who had convinced him to stay quiet. She made it all sound so rational, Michael said, his voice breaking. Like it was the only choice we had. Throughout Michael's testimony, Helena remained stone-faced, her expression unreadable. Her defense team, led by the charismatic attorney William Greer, worked tirelessly to discredit Michael's account. Greer argued that Michael was a liar and a manipulator, a man driven by jealousy and rage who had acted on his own and was now trying to shift the blame to Helena to save himself. Michael Trent is not a victim, Greer declared during his cross-examination. He is a cold-blooded killer who is using my client as a scapegoat. He is the one who couldn't control his temper, and he alone is responsible for Jacob Callahan's death. Greer called attention to Michael's history of impulsive behavior, presenting witnesses who described his short temper and volatile personality. He also pointed to the lack of direct evidence tying Helena to the act of murder. While the financial records and fibers from the tarp suggested her involvement, there were no fingerprints on the murder weapon and no witnesses who had seen her commit the crime. She may not have been a perfect wife, Greer admitted, but being unhappy in a marriage is not a crime. Letting a dangerous man like Michael Trent into her life was her mistake, not her plan. The trial took an even darker turn when the prosecution presented a series of love letters exchanged between Helena and Michael in the months leading up to Jacob's death. The letters, filled with passionate declarations and cryptic references to a new life, revealed the depth of their affair and their willingness to take drastic measures to be together. One letter, written by Helena, sent a ripple through the courtroom. I feel like I'm suffocating in this house, in this life. But with you, I can breathe again. I'll do whatever it takes to make this work. No one will stand in our way. The letter was a smoking gun for the prosecution, cementing their argument that Helena had not only participated in the crime but had actively planned it. For weeks, the trial dragged on, the emotional toll on Jacob's family evident in every session. His elderly mother sat in the front row each day, clutching a photograph of her son and wiping away tears as gruesome details of his death were recounted. Friends and neighbors spoke of Jacob's kindness, his dedication to his work, and his dreams of building a better future. Their testimonies served as stark reminders of the life that had been stolen and the void left behind. As the trial approached its conclusion, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Both sides presented their closing arguments, each trying to sway the jury toward their version of the truth. For the prosecution, Helena was a manipulative and cold-hearted mastermind. For the defense, she was a victim of Michael's violent tendencies, caught in a nightmare she couldn't escape. On March 6, 2012, nearly a year after Jacob's body had been discovered, the jury delivered its verdict. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Helena Callahan, the foreperson said, her voice steady, "We find you guilty of first-degree murder." Helena's face remained composed, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the table in front of her. The sentence, life without the possibility of parole, sealed her fate. Michael Trent, having cooperated with the prosecution, received a reduced sentence of 5 years for second-degree murder. As Helena was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the townspeople of Cedarville breathed a collective sigh of relief. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But for Jacob's family and friends, the pain of his loss would linger far longer than any prison sentence. The verdict brought a sense of closure to Cedarville, but the scars left by the betrayal and murder of Jacob Callahan would take far longer to heal. The Callahan home, once a place of warmth and love, now stood as a grim reminder of the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. By late 2012, Jacob's family decided to sell the property. It was too painful to see, a place that had once symbolized hard work and devotion now irreparably tainted by betrayal and death. The new owners, aware of the property's tragic history, wasted no time in making changes. The infamous backyard patio, the very spot where Jacob's body had been buried, was demolished. In its place, the owners planted a small garden, a quiet and somber act of renewal. Over time, the garden flourished, its vibrant flowers standing in bittersweet contrast to the darkness they concealed. For many in Cedarville, the garden became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of tragedy, life could bloom again. Jacob's family, meanwhile, channeled their grief into something meaningful. In early 2013, they established the Jacob Callahan Memorial Fund, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting local businesses and helping struggling families. Jacob had always been the kind of man who offered a helping hand, and his family wanted his legacy to reflect that spirit. The fund quickly became a beacon of hope for Cedarville, helping dozens of families rebuild their lives and restoring a sense of community to the shaken town. But while Cedarville began to heal, Helena Callahan adjusted to life behind bars. By 2014, she had granted several interviews to true crime authors and documentary filmmakers, each time portraying herself as a victim of circumstance. In these carefully staged appearances, Helena maintained her innocence, claiming she had been manipulated by Michael Trent and misunderstood by the public. "I didn't kill Jacob," she insisted during one televised interview, her voice steady but cold. "I loved him in my own way, but I was trapped. Michael, he's the one who lost control. I was just trying to survive." Yet her words rang hollow for those who knew the truth. She rarely mentioned Jacob by name, avoiding any discussion of his life or their marriage. Instead, she focused on her own suffering, painting herself as a misunderstood woman who had been unfairly vilified. Her lack of genuine remorse was glaring, and the public remained unmoved by her attempts to rewrite the narrative. For the people of Cedarville, Helena's interviews only deepened their disdain for her. To them, she was not a victim but a woman consumed by greed and ambition, willing to sacrifice anyone who stood in the way of her desires. Her name became synonymous with betrayal, a chilling cautionary tale whispered in quiet conversations and late-night porch gatherings. Michael Trent's life after his release from prison followed a very different trajectory. Having cooperated with the prosecution, he served just 5 years for his role in Jacob's murder. But even after regaining his freedom, he would never escape the shadow of his crime. Those who knew him described a man haunted by guilt, his once charismatic demeanor replaced by quiet remorse. Unlike Helena, Michael avoided public attention, retreating into anonymity and leading a reclusive life far from Cedarville. While Helena sought to reshape her image, Michael seemed intent on disappearing entirely. For many in the town, his withdrawal was an acknowledgement of his guilt, a silent admission that he could never undo the harm he had caused. As the years passed, the story of Jacob Callahan became more than just a crime, it became a legend, a painful chapter in Cedarville's history that revealed the depths of human betrayal and the fragility of trust. Parents told their children about Jacob's kindness, using his story as a lesson about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of integrity. His name was spoken with reverence, a symbol of the goodness that had been taken too soon. By 2015, the garden that replaced the patio had become a cherished part of the neighborhood. Its blooms were vibrant and full of life, a stark contrast to the darkness they concealed. Children played near its edges, unaware of the tragedy that had once defined the space. For Jacob's family, the garden was a bittersweet reminder of his loss and the resilience of the community that had rallied in the wake of his death. The Jacob Callahan Memorial Fund continued to grow, its impact extending beyond Cedarville. By 2020, it had helped over 100 families across Indiana, providing everything from financial assistance to educational scholarships. Jacob's name became synonymous with generosity and hope, a legacy far more enduring than the betrayal that had ended his life. For Helena, however, time offered no redemption. Her attempts to maintain her innocence and reshape the public's perception of her failed miserably. Each new interview only reinforced the image of a woman devoid of empathy, more concerned with her own narrative than the man whose life she had destroyed. By the late 2010s, she had faded from public attention, her story overshadowed by newer, equally shocking crimes. But for those in Cedarville, the memory of her betrayal remained vivid. Michael, too, remained a ghost of his former self. Though free, he was far from unburdened. The guilt of his actions weighed heavily on him, and his once ambitious plans for a better life seemed to evaporate. For the people of Cedarville, his reduced sentence was a source of frustration, a reminder that justice, while served, was not always complete. In the end, the story of Jacob Callahan was a tale of contrasts, love and betrayal, light and darkness, resilience and loss. It revealed the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of unchecked greed. But it also showed the power of community, the strength of those who refused to let tragedy define them. Years later, when visitors passed by the old Callahan home, they would often pause to admire the garden. Its vivid flowers swayed gently in the breeze, a living testament to renewal and hope. Yet beneath its beauty lay an unshakable truth, a reminder of the darkness that had once lurked there. For Cedarville, the memory of Jacob Callahan remained a somber yet unifying force. His kindness, his generosity, and his unwavering dedication to his community would never be forgotten. And while the shadows of betrayal lingered, they were overshadowed by the light of the legacy he left behind, a legacy that continued to inspire long after his tragic death.